few words about myself real quickly. I'm Michael Ronkin. I have a very small consulting firm called Designing Streets for People, LLC. I'll introduce you to my entire staff. Oh, here we are. And prior to that, I did work for the Oregon Department of Transportation for about 26 years, and 17 of those years as the Bicycle and Pedestrian Program Manager. And the reason I mention that is Oregon has had the strongest complete street policy for almost 40 years. 1971 it was adopted. It wasn't called Complete Streets. It was called the Bike Bill, a misnomer because it applied to bicyclists and pedestrians, and it's still the one to beat. It mandates, it's a shall condition, that on every road, street, or highway project, bikeways and walkways shall be included. And there are some exceptions, and we'll talk about the exceptions, but it does make it that Oregon really is a leader, and you look at streets in Oregon, it's very rare to find an urban street that doesn't accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists. It didn't include transit, and we'll get into that. And so I've been working with the Complete Streets Coalition for about 4 years now. We actually started in Virginia, because do you know that Virginia DOT adopted a Complete Streets policy? How many of you knew that? Okay, you didn't know that. Okay, how effective has it been? That's one of the reasons why they called us in about 3 years ago, because they adopted the policy about 6, 7 years ago, and there were concerns that it really wasn't being applied the way that it should be. So let me ask you this before we start off. How many of you have heard of Complete Streets before coming to this workshop? Okay. You have a pretty good idea of what it means, I imagine, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through what Complete Streets mean. I got 3 separate PowerPoint presentations, and for the sake of time, I'm going to ask you to withhold questions on each one as I work my way through them. Then we'll have plenty of time for questions and just open discussion. And then, like I said, I've got some exercises in which you're going to participate. If there is a burning question that has something to do with something on a slide, like you dispute a number or the decimal points in the wrong place or some kind of detail like that that makes it hard to understand the slide, that's fine if you ask the question then. One of the reasons I do that is not only for the sake of efficiency, but very often people do ask questions that is going to be covered a little bit later anyhow. So does this look familiar to you? Does this look familiar to you? How we honor transit patrons, right? Or bike routes that just end, or this right here, right? You build a ramp into the road and no way to get out of the road. Todd and I were talking quite a bit about congestion on the way in, and I've solved the congestion problem in this country. It's very simple. You build freeways with entrances only, no exits. That's it. Congestion disappears overnight. We know how to build it right. Every community we go to, people do find examples in their own community of streets that work really well, and yet we're still building streets like this, really dysfunctional streets. And I was very, very impressed. I'm not necessarily saying that in a positive way either, how incredibly wide your roads are here. Drove in from the airport, and how incredibly wide your intersections are here, and what a nightmare it must be for a pedestrian to try to get through these intersections. We highlighted the pedestrian here a little bit for you so you could see that obviously no one gave pedestrians any thought when they widened this intersection not too long ago. The reason why we like the term complete street is that it is pretty much self-explanatory. We like to think that 20 years from now, where it's just become the way to do business, young people entering the transportation planning profession will scratch their heads and say, you mean there's a time we built incomplete streets, right? It's basically a street that accommodates all modes, all users. I like to make the comparison to housing and insulation. Would you consider building a house without insulation? No, every building code in the country requires insulation. Yet 50, 60 years ago, it wasn't the case, right? You can still find houses that don't have insulation, and you kind of wonder what they were thinking, right? A complete street policy makes sure that the entire right-of-way is designed for all users, and the right-of-way usually goes way beyond the pavement, and all too often people think of a road as a roadway as the pavement only, yet in all state codes, the highway is defined as the right-of-way, so highway with a little h, when you're doing any kind of a street project or highway project, the entire right-of-way should be considered under the needs of all users. When we talk about all users, of course, we illustrate here people not in cars, because the ones that are in cars are pretty obviously accommodated for, right? All ages and abilities. The important thing to understand about a complete street policy is it really is very different from so many very well-intended and sometimes fairly well-implemented policies that encourage the consideration of modes other than the automobile on projects and in planning. The difference with those earlier efforts in a real complete streets policy is that it makes it the default, a little bit like the house. You build a house, you put in insulation, just so you have studs for the frame, and you got plywood for the siding, right, and things like that. So you just assume you're going to be providing for all modes. It makes it the default on all your transportation projects. We'll talk a little bit about exceptions. Even though a complete street policy, if you do adopt one, doesn't mean you'll instantly have a complete network of bikeways, walkways, and transit will just operate magnificently overnight. It's something that you have to think of over time. But if you look at the roadway system in this country, we had a network of Indian trails, right, for a few hundred years, and then horse wagon trails, and then railroads, and finally started developing highways in the mid-19th century. We started paving them in the early part of the 20th century. It took time to get the roadway system that we had. So if you think in terms of generations, a jurisdiction adopts a complete street policy now, there's a pretty good chance that within 20 years or so, the network will be complete. The reason why we mention network is Todd told me he had a speaker last week from Smart Growth America who really pointed out that that is absolutely key. You really need to think in terms of network and get away from the type of development that you see on the lower half of this slide, which is, the disconnected lollipop cul-de-sacs, single use instead of mixed use, leading onto really big arterials instead of the greater connectivity that you see in the northern half of this graphic right here. And one of the main reasons a lot of jurisdictions have very wide roads is because they didn't think about connectivity. And if you only have a few roads to carry most of the traffic, they're going to have to be very wide. And that makes it very, very daunting for walking, bicycling, and difficult for transit, too. The other thing about complete streets is when a policy is adopted, it doesn't just apply to the big capital-intensive projects. The CIP doesn't stand for capital-intensive projects, but that's what I like to call it, right? Your capital improvement plan, or your TIP, your transportation improvement plan. Those are the ones that get a lot of attention. They're the ones that get the big bucks from the federal or the state government. They're the ones that get a lot of attention in the media. They're the ones that are very expensive. And if you look at all the work that's occurring on roads and streets at any given moment in a community, whether it be a city or a county or a state, hardly any of those projects are in the tip. It doesn't mean that public involvement is being bypassed, but there's maintenance workers out there doing maintenance work, there's repaving, there's developers coming in, there's small community grants and things like that. So a complete streets policy means no matter when or where work is being performed on the street, consider the needs of pedestrians and bicyclists, and if there is a need, accommodate them as part of that project. We'll talk a little bit about cost and funding later on, but essentially complete streets is a good way to save money too. It gets the street right in the first place instead of expensive retrofits. Again, getting back to the housing and insulation analogy, has anyone tried retrofitting insulation into an existing house? It's not that easy, right? You got to blow it in or tear out the walls, right? And much more expensive than doing it right the first time. I think that applies to virtually anything we do in life. What's really interesting is if you look at the way that our funds are being spent in this country, and the thing I like to say about funding and policy is, in theory, funding should follow policy, right? If you develop and adopt a really good transportation strategy and policy, then of course your funding should follow that. Unfortunately, funding has a life of its own. It's almost the other way around. Funding directs policy. Once you send up funding pots and funding silos for specific purposes, then of course that's where everyone gravitates towards because that's where the money is, right? So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And people tend to forget when they're told, well, we really can't fund your project because these funds are dedicated for some other purpose. That was set up legislatively maybe 20, 30 years ago, and there's no reason that cannot be changed. They're not lying to you. They're just telling you the way it is, but it doesn't have to be that way. I like to think we live in a democracy where those things could be changed. So the funding, the way it's set up in this country, definitely favor roads. And yet if you ask people, this was a survey that was conducted nationwide by Rails to Trails. We conducted a similar one in Oregon about 12 years ago. We broke up into 5 categories. We added maintenance and environmental stewardship to these 3 categories here of roadway improvements, public transit, bicycling, and walking. And look what the people of America tell us. This is more or less how they like to see the funds dedicated. We do replicate the percentages down below in case you can't read the graph. So I wouldn't say, one could say a roughly equal split, right, between the 3 main surface transportation modes. And can anyone guess where the money really goes? Right, it's about 80% to roads, about 20% to transit, and walking and bicycling can get about 1%. So huge disconnect. The problem with this, it's not that you can't change it is that to change it, you have to change the policies that set up those funding mechanisms in the first place. So if you want to dedicate 22% of your funds to bicycling and walking and 41% to transit, you can, but you have to go back and undo so many of the policies that led to this funding, and then, like I said, it becomes a vicious cycle. We've done quite a few workshops in Virginia, and we'll talk about one thing that really gets in your way that you can change if you want to. Get to that in about 20 minutes, I think. But Complete Streets is really about people, right? It's making sure that everyone has access. Who here is not planning on getting older? Okay, once I've had a wise guy raise his hand, and I don't know, 300 times I've asked this question, I would say. And what's really unfortunate, I've got a son-in-law who's a gerontologist. He's now leading up Senior Corps in Washington, and we talk a lot about this. Seniors being trapped in their homes. Let me ask you this. How many of you live in a house you think you can age in? That at age 75 or so, maybe 80, you realize you may have to give up driving. You think you'll be able to continue to live in that house and enjoy all the benefits of your community, right? Very few hands go up. That's interesting. Health. A lot has been talked about the health problems associated with inactivity. We talk a lot about the obesity epidemic, but most public health people are starting to talk more about physical inactivity or the lack of physical activity. It's pretty ironic that no population in the world moves more than we do. Americans, we move a lot. Unfortunately, we choose a mode of transportation where we're sitting down, so we're exerting absolutely no effort whatsoever, which leads to all kinds of health risks that have been very, very well documented. It's too bad I didn't have time, but someone who's been working with us just sent me a graph that she put together, and it shows the rise in obesity over the last 20 years in this country and the increase in vehicle miles traveled from about 1985 to 2005 or something like that, and the two lines track exactly parallel to each other. Yeah, it's just a correlation. I found that pretty interesting. So again, getting back to physical activity, you probably have seen all the media reports pointing out that there is no doubt that people are more physically active in environments where you can do that. Colorado, Minnesota are often touted as the fittest states, Denver, Boulder, Minneapolis, those places. And it's true, you go there, you do see more opportunities for walking, bicycling, taking transit, more active forms of transportation. This is probably, I showed you one pie chart, and I think this is the only other graph that I'm going to show you, okay? There's going to be some bullets, but this one is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll walk you through it anyhow. Just had dinner with him last week, John Pucher from Rutgers. He's been doing a lot of research on active modes of transportation and their impact on community health. And this is one that links physical activity with the modes that people use. And it's, it's not all 17, but, it's something like 17 industrialized nations in the world, and this isn't all of them, but the majority of them. And it's really unfortunate how the U.S. is so often number one, but number one in the wrong sense of the term, right? So we're number one in obesity, that's the red line, and we're number 17. No, sorry, wait a minute, could I get backwards? Yeah, with the red line, so we're number one. But we're at the very bottom when it comes to active modes of transportation, and there is an absolute reverse correlation. And Betsy did point out I live in Switzerland now, and Switzerland is the slimmest country of all the developed nations, and it is definitely related to how much physical activity people get in their daily lives. Safety is an interesting one because all DOTs, all public works, they really do talk sincerely about safety. There's no doubt about that. What's unfortunate is safety is so misunderstood, and more research is being conducted that finally validates claims that we've been making for quite a few years now. Next week, you have my good friend Dan Burden, who's going to be speaking to you, and he and I have been saying some pretty outrageous things that go completely contrary to conventional wisdom about safety, and people really raise their eyebrows, and the research has finally caught up with us, validating what we've been saying. And University of Connecticut has done some, for example, demonstrating that if you design streets with people in mind first, you really create them for people, you really think of the pedestrian, you think of the bicyclist, that's your design parameter, they're much, much safer streets, including for drivers. The communities with more walking, more biking, more attention to their roadway design have fewer crashes overall. The communities that have the highest crash rates and the most crashes per capita are the ones that have developed in the more suburban type pattern, like what we call the Sun Belt states. Are you considered part of the Sun Belt? I wouldn't have guessed it coming in tonight, but basically basically the Southeast, all the way through New Mexico and Arizona, Florida, they have the worst crashes of all. And these are all places that have been developed with more of a suburban pattern, very wide, high-speed roads. People drive a lot, very little walking, very little bicycling, really bad safety problems in those places. You know, we don't wish this on anybody, of course, but it could happen to any of us, that we lose the ability to get around. So, of course, a lot of people need other modes of transportation. Again, people often ask about the cost of complete streets, and you also have to ask about the cost of not doing it right. Last week, when I gave a similar talk at Rutgers, someone from the New Jersey Public Health pointed out the horrendous cost in public health of physical activity. And it's kind of interesting. I've always thought it's fairly similar. She said $2.4 billion, which is about more or less what we spend on surface transportation in this country. So, you know, if you look at a really big problem and how it's linked in part to physical inactivity and where we spend the money in transportation, there's that inverse correlation again. But just to give you an example as it relates to transit, paratransit are these kind of vans that go around and pick people up at their homes and take them to their destinations. Very, very expensive service. If instead you made all transit accessible, so you wouldn't have to go directly to people's homes, it'd really be a huge savings over time, plus it's a mode that everyone can use. You know, don't need to dwell too long on the environmental impacts, of course, of driving, and we focus so much of our attention on air pollution and the consumption of gasoline. The one that we tend to forget is road widening, and I find it kind of interesting coming in here. I was really amazed at how wide your roads are, and Todd was talking about a road widening project. You know, when is it ever going to end, right? And there's no doubt that road widening is starting to have a huge environmental impact, not just on the physical environment like watersheds and wetlands, but just on people too. We need to remember that. There's people living in these places too. We need to start thinking in terms of human habitats, which environmentalists tend to forget sometimes. And the reason why this is the point we try to make with accommodating the more benign modes, walking, bicycling, and transit, is in spite of what people think as far as congestion in their communities, it's rarely due to people coming from outside their community or through their community. It's got very little to do with longer trips. It has to do with the very large percentage of very short trips that we take in our communities using these few roads because we don't have good connectivity, and they add up to an awful lot of miles of travel that could be replaced with walking and bicycling because there are such short trips, right? So when you look at road widening and congestion, it's not that commuter who's driving 30 miles to work in another city that's causing the problem. It's all the moms and pops and kids and others who get in their car throughout the day for very short trips. Again, when we talk about costs, we need to look at benefits. I'm really pleased in the last 5 or 6 years or so, we don't talk about cost-benefit, we talk about benefit-cost. I think that's a much more positive way of putting it. So even though you know you're going to be spending money on something, you hope to get a benefit out of it. And what's really interesting is someone made the point to me once that for the first 60 or 70 years or so of the 20th century, building highways definitely had a positive impact on communities. It brought goods and services, linked communities together. In the last 30 years or so of the 20th century, building highways actually had a negative impact on communities. It helped people come through the cities faster. It tore cities apart. People were able to leave cities. And we've all seen what's happened to many cities around the country. And so we're looking at what are the benefits, and there's absolutely no doubt that a street that is really healthy, that is thriving, that's got good retail, that's accessible on foot and by bicycle is better for the community. Another point about economics, too, is that as much as we talk about the horrendous housing crisis in this country, quite a few places are starting to experience something interesting, and that is housing is no longer the number one household expenditure, it's transportation. I don't know if you've heard the term drive till you qualify. That means people are living further and further out from the community because they can't afford a house closer in. They go so far out that then the transportation costs overwhelm their housing costs, and they've really gained nothing. So again, building communities where people can get around more easily is better for the community and better for individuals. I talked about how complete streets affects all streets and all roads, all construction projects. Let's just have a few examples how it affects your basic design. You go from an intersection with a 130-foot long crosswalk to something with a median and a well-marked crosswalk, a lot easier for people to cross. Bicycling turns from a white-knuckle experience on the white line to a place where people feel a lot more comfortable bicycling. Transit, instead of this undignified sign, a little concrete pad out in the middle of nowhere, you provide a real bus stop with shelters, a real crossing so people can get to the bus. It changes accessibility. Now this is interesting. So many complete streets policies talk about the disabilities and access for people with disabilities. This has been the law for 20 years. Right? We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and this is a shall also. You know, any jurisdiction that has built a road or street in the last 20 years that isn't accessible violated federal civil rights law. But of course, it is good to include it in a complete streets policy. When we started the website about 5 or 6 years ago, we got some really interesting emails that were always forwarded to me, because even though I'm not an engineer, I like to play one on TV, right? I was sent this email, came back over and over again. Well, we'd like to adopt a complete street policy. Can you just send us a typical complete streets cross-section, or adopt that in our design manual? And that's not at all the way that it works. Okay, it's not a design prescription. This is how you have to do it. It's not a mandate for immediate retrofit, and Todd and I were talking about that on the way in too. You know, you got to look at all the retrofits, but it does apply to road construction or maintenance projects. It's not a silver bullet. Last week you had someone from Smart Growth America. Next week you had Dan Burden talking about walkability. There are so many other concurrent efforts that you need to pursue to create livable communities, like land use. You know, that creates proximity, mixed use, street connectivity, environmental concerns. You know, runoff is a big one these days. Strategies to reduce vehicle miles traveled. But in all cases, complete streets help all these efforts. One size doesn't fit all. When we talk about complete streets, you need to think in terms of streets have many different functions, many different contexts. I'm just going to walk you through a few images here, and all of these we consider complete streets. This is my favorite one right here. It's in a city that's often voted the best city in North America. I didn't say the United States, right? It's Vancouver, British Columbia. This is Water Street, beautiful street right through downtown. It's complete. It does accommodate all the users. Let's start with the sides. Business is thriving. Right? People are walking, people are driving, they're parking their cars, going to the businesses, people are riding bikes. That 12-year-old girl in the front is very confident in the middle of the lane. It's got transit, right? So the four main surface transportation modes are well accommodated on this street. And you can see what's totally lacking? Any traffic engineering whatsoever. It's what we call a naked street. Pedestrians are on the sidewalk, so it's not really a shared street, but it's called a naked street. So anything that's got wheels is out there on the street without any dedicated space. There's no transit lane, there's no travel lanes, there's no center line, there's no bike lanes, but it's complete. If people can use it and are using it, it's a complete street. Sometimes it's just one little project in a street that otherwise serves the users pretty well. So if you have a safe routes to school program and kids are having trouble crossing this one busy street, you put in a good crossing, like with this refuge island right here, you've completed that street. So like I said, it's not always big capital improvement projects looking at long corridors. In a more rural environment, and this is my first time, well actually I was in Williamsburg a few years ago. It's my first time in Virginia Beach, and I had no idea it was this dense here, but I've done quite a bit of work in Virginia, and Virginia is quite rural. And on rural county roads with low density residential, with our people, right, shoulders accommodate users very well, including pedestrians too. Pedestrians are well served by paved shoulders, so the street is complete. In a really busy downtown environment, like what you've just built fairly recently here in your town center, then you're really looking at clearly defined dedicated spaces for all the modes. This street says all the modes are accommodated because there's a dedicated space for all of them. For transit, it could simply mean making sure that shelters are provided, safe crossings also, right? And this is the one that got people kind of confused because so many of our roads are suburban, so many of them are quite a challenge. I was pretty impressed that most of your thoroughfares, at least the ones we came in on, seem to have sidewalks. Some of them on the Norfolk side had shoulders. We actually passed a couple of bicyclists using them. And in the suburbs, this would be appropriate. So you've got your median, you've got your travel lanes, you've got your bike lane, you've got your sidewalk separated by a buffer. And the reason why I said this created a lot of concern, people thought, this is what we have to build for complete streets? No, not at all. If you got a suburban thoroughfare, yes, this is what it should look like. It doesn't mean every street has to look like a suburban thoroughfare, right? It's all about context. For example, this is interesting. This was a discussion we had when we did these workshops in Virginia about 4 years ago. Skinny streets. And you're one of the states that unfortunately the DOT, I'm not trying to bash the DOT, I'm just talking the way that it's set up, has its standards that apply across the boards. And we talked about how difficult it was in Virginia to adopt skinny streets, because the research has shown that narrower streets are safer than wide streets. It also saves you a lot of money. The developer doesn't have to put as much into the right-of-way, so more of the land can be turned over to the private sector, which in turn generates taxable property, right? Creates revenue for the jurisdiction rather than something that sucks revenue, a wide street. So there's many, many good reasons to adopt skinny streets standards. Or really low volume streets. Just yesterday, someone came up to me after a workshop and showed me a Safe House to School project that he had, $250,000, which is not that much, but pretty substantial to get kids to school. I can't remember exactly how long it was. It was maybe 15, 20 blocks. And he showed me one block of a really narrow street that really creates a great shortcut. The kids are going there anyhow, it avoids going around to the school, and the person who was in charge of the program insisted he had to put a sidewalk on that street. So that's absurd. There's hardly any traffic on it. It's quite narrow. The sidewalk would be really expensive on that street, and what he wanted to do was just stripe out an area to the side so kids could walk both ways, put in some delineators for that one block, and I said, yeah, that's a perfectly apt solution for this context. So we don't need to, we shouldn't think that complete streets always means you have to do more. Sometimes it's doing less. And, you've heard the cliche, do more with less. Well, we're all running out of money, and my answer to that is, how about we do less with less? Right, if we've got less money, let's do less. Historic main streets, a lot of people are concerned that, oh my gosh, it's going to be like urban renewal in the 70s, how many cities were destroyed thanks to urban removal, as Jane Jacobs called it? No, we're not asking you to tear down your trees and widen the streets and have skinny sidewalks up against the buildings or tear down these awnings. Of course not. What's interesting is that even though the term complete streets is fairly recent, it's not really anything that new. The design manuals are really very supportive of it. How many of you have heard of AASHTO? It comes up quite a bit. The Green Book, right? People love to trash it. If only they realize how supportive of complete streets AASHTO is, it's just been misused. There's no doubt about that. This statement has been in there for a long time. Sidewalks are integral parts of city streets. That's a complete street statement. It doesn't say you add them to streets or that you need to consider them or streets should also include sidewalks. They're an integral part of city streets. So any jurisdiction that's built urban streets the last 40 years or so without sidewalks, claiming, well, we follow the AASHTO guidelines. No, you didn't. The guidelines, by the way, they're not standards, right? Not as strong a statement for bicyclists, but we did find this. Shoulders are desirable on urban arterials, and bike lanes are basically shoulders designated for bicycle use. I do a lot of workshops, do a lot of training with mostly engineers and planners. And one thing that we found out working in states where, well, it happens in all states, but when a state highway goes through a community and the community wants the state highway to look and feel very different, it's often their main street. And we talked to the people who work for the DOT, and some of the engineers have expressed incredible frustration. They say, we understand what the communities want. We'd like to do what the communities want. Our design manuals don't allow us to do that. I'm talking about the state design manuals. AASHTO does. What happens very often is the state DOTs adopt a much higher standard that the guidelines recommend, or the highest of the standards, and you need to get an exception to bring it down to more human scale. They're basically seeking permission to do the right thing. I hinted at this a little bit, funding. It's not about creating a new funding source. Of course, a lot of naysayers say, well, it's another unfunded mandate. No, it's not an unfunded mandate. Even though the pie is shrinking and revenue sources are drying up because we're just too afraid to increase the gas tax in this country, we are getting money. Money is still coming in. I mean, I just rented a car this morning and had to get gas in it. So, I saw other people pull up the gas pump. Money is coming to the coffers, right? And there are all these programs out there, STP, Surface Transportation Policy, that is the number one. CMAQ, Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality, Transportation Enhancement. Whatever it is that you're using for transportation, if you've got a complete streets policy, remember that pie that I showed you, you just divide up the pie a little bit differently. A friend of mine there's 2 points I like to make about taxation in general and revenue for the government. I heard a very interesting report on NPR a couple of years ago about taxes in this country. It turns out that since the creation of this country, about 230 years ago now, pretty close, right? to nowadays, Americans have been willing to tax themselves at about the same rate, which is right around 30%. It varies from 29 to 30 to 31%, which is pretty generous, almost a third of our income. This includes income tax, property taxes, levies, user fees, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that this analysis pointed out was it doesn't vary that much from state to state. Some states have no income tax, some states have a very high income tax, some states have a sales tax, property taxes vary and all that, but from state to state, the bandwidth is 29 to 31%. Cities, counties, and state DOTs get about the same amount of transportation dollars per capita across this country. So when you see cities that are doing really hot things, like Seattle, for example, Los Angeles now is doing amazing stuff, right? New York is becoming legendary. They're not getting more money than you are. They're just spending it very differently. So does it cost more? Not really. You avoid costly retrofits, minimal additional funding to include these features on a new street project. You can save a lot of money through better design too, because what people don't realize is how huge a percentage of a DOT's funding or public works goes to maintenance, right? And if you don't build it well in the first place, you're spending a lot more on maintenance further down the street. And then you got to think in terms, of course, like I said, the benefit cost. If you build a complete street and more people are using it, you're getting more use out of that street, right? So I'll briefly talk about the different types of complete streets policies, what a policy looks like, and I'll have this section wrapped up pretty soon. The 6 main avenues are through they're pretty much in importance in order of efficiency, I should say, effectiveness. Number 1 is through legislation. Oregon has a law. You got to do it. Resolution, City Council will pass a resolution. Funding measures, design manuals, just get in your manuals, is a very good start. Internal department policies, and then your comp plan. The comp plan is the weakest one. It doesn't mean any one of these are bad, it just points out the different approaches you can take. This is probably the only slide I'm going to show you with this many bullets. You know the comedian Chris Rock who said, guns don't kill people, bullets kill people? Well, I think it's the same thing with PowerPoint, so I'll try not to kill you here. But I think it is important that we've been talking about a complete streets policy, and some of you are wondering, well, what does one look like? The 9 elements we like to include are setting up a vision of what you like your community to look like. That's always pretty important to know where you're going with a plan, right? It includes all forms of travel. Emphasizes connectivity, like we talked about. Applies to all transportation projects and phasing, so some from planning to construction, planning, design, construction, maintenance, but including some of these operational fixes that happen out there. For example, redoing a traffic signal, making sure the loop detectors are sensitive to bicyclists, make sure the pedestrian push button actually is hooked up to a wire that changes the light. Specifies and limits exemptions. There's no doubt that not every project will have all of these features, and we'll talk about that a little bit. You probably should update your design standards, make sure they're up to date, but also flexible. Too many people think, well, now that we got this complete street policy, these standards, this is what we have to follow. No, there's a lot of flexibility built into it, including being sensitive to the context, right? So don't tear down trees or tear down historic buildings in the name of complete streets. We'll spend some time on this later on, performance standards. Just like number 1, set a vision, you want to know where you're going. You also want to find out, are you getting there? Are you really making a difference, right? And we'll talk about how the current performance standards for road projects do not capture complete streets at all. And then some implementation steps here. I mean, any plan should include a roadmap on how to go there. Do we have any attorneys here? I'm not bashing attorneys. My daughter's going to law school. Okay. Because do people understand the burden of proof, right? We live in a society, good. You want to explain it then?
Sure, burden of proof, generally. What's the burden of proving? You have to be able to back up your facts. You have to be able to demonstrate with verifiable items whatever you are trying to do.
Right, exactly. Whoever is bringing a case forward has to prove the case. So of course, the most classic example is in civil law, criminal law. I mean, if you're accused of a crime, the government has to prove its case. You don't have to prove your innocence, right? What complete streets do, it actually reverses a burden of proof. We're not saying innocent people have to prove their innocence, right? We're saying that you don't have to justify including facilities for pedestrians, for bicyclists, and transit on your projects. You just assume they're going to be included, and then the burden of proof is on the DOT, Public Works, whomever, to prove that they weren't needed. That's the reversal of burden of proof, right? Two of the ways that projects are initiated and then thought through and carried through the different processes to final design include these two terms here, project scope and checklist. People are more familiar with that. And rather than just talk about them now, I'll talk about how Complete Streets addresses these two issues. The project scope is usually a group of people have heard, or it comes to their awareness that there's a problem out there, right? Engineers are problem fixers. And so they go out and look at the roadway or intersection in question. They find out, yeah, indeed there is a problem. You know, the pavement's falling apart, it needs to be repaved. It's flooding, it needs more drainage, right? There's crashes, it needs to be made safer. And what often happens is the project scope is limited by that first project ID. So if someone says there's a drainage problem, you send out your geotechnical engineers, the drainage people, all that. They say, yep, there's a drainage problem. They come up with a solution to solve the drainage problem. And then local advocates, citizens, elected officials, other people get wind of it and say, whoa, time out. That's all you're going to do out there? Do you realize that kids are walking to school then? There's no place for them to walk. Bicyclists have no place to bike. There's actually a pretty bad crash history out there. How come you're not fixing that? Then the answer is, that's not part of the project scope. So, of course, your answer should be, well, why didn't you include it in your project scope, right? So Complete Streets does put more of a burden on people doing that original project scope to really look at all the issues that could be associated with that piece of roadway. In this example right here, it's like, how could they have not noticed there's a goat trail there, people walking, and they didn't complete that piece of sidewalk, right? And the other part of how projects are developed that leaves out so many elements of what people would like to see are what I call the infamous checklists, because I've seen many of these checklists that were developed back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and some of them are still around now, that make it so easy for the engineer of record just to go through there. No, I didn't see any pedestrians. Nope, no need for sidewalks. I stood out there for 10 minutes, didn't see any bicyclists. Nope, no need for bicycle lanes. Nope. Buses? I didn't see any buses. I didn't take the trouble to see if it was on a transit route. Nope. No need to accommodate transit, and that was it. End of story, right? A good friend of mine likes to point out that if that's the method we use to build bridges in this country, we'd wait to see if people were swimming across a river before we decided a bridge was needed, right? That goes over really well here. I mean, you've got a lot of water here, right? Yeah. Or tunnels. I didn't see anyone scuba diving, so we don't need to build a tunnel, all right? So let's look how it works on these two examples right here. And I chose two extremes. I remember you've seen these photos already. These are what we consider complete streets, one in a very rural setting, one in a much more urban setting. And it also helps exemplify how the complete streets exemption process works too. So on the left, you look at it and you say to yourselves, well, you know, you said it was rural residential. There are people living out there. It turns out just over the hill there, there's a little grocery store, and people do walk there. So if you had a complete streets policy, you say, well, under those conditions, you should put a sidewalk. There's enough people walking out there should be a sidewalk. But then you look at the density, and it's like, you know, minimum 1 acre lots. And you also look at the fact that there's drainage required out there, right? So the exemptions always have to deal with the need. So there seems to be some need, right? You can't say there's no need. But look at number 2. The cost would be disproportionately high relative to need. So adding shoulders on that roadway might have cost, say, $200,000 a mile. Let's just use a number, right? Putting in drainage, closing that ditch, putting in closed drainage, and building a sidewalk may have added $800,000 or $900,000 a mile to a project. The pavement overlay may be as little as $150,000 a mile. Adding bike lanes, shoulders, another $150,000 a mile. You put in sidewalks, you're now quadrupling, quintupling the cost of the project for a relatively low need. And it turns out the shoulders accommodate pedestrians pretty well, right? So that's how the burden of proof works. You have to demonstrate why sidewalks weren't included there. On the right, on an urban arterial with fairly high traffic volumes, that's a thoroughfare that goes through your community, your complete streets policy says you should have dedicated bike lanes. So you look at the context and you say to yourself, wow, the only way to get dedicated bike lanes on there would be remove parking. Okay, businesses won't like that. Or widen the roadway and narrow the sidewalks. I don't think people would be happy with that. So the mitigating circumstance there is the speeds are so low that bicyclists can safely share the roadway. And so you've proven, you've made your case, as the gentleman said, that you don't need them. We're at a transformative moment. I think we really need to, I mean, I feel really bad for all the people out of work, don't get me wrong, the businesses that are suffering, but it's also an opportunity to reflect, you know, and if the economy does recover, do we want to do what we've done for the last 40 years, or just keep building like crazy and building out? Here's what I ask people. I mean, how many of you have been living here for about, say, 30 to 40 years in this part of the country? A few of you. Think about how the road system has expanded and all the widening that's happened in the last 30 years or so, and exponentially carry that out the next 30 years. It's unimaginable, right? So if a road was 2 lanes 35 years ago, it's 5 lanes now. That would mean there'd be 12 or 13 lanes in the next 30 years if you carry that through, right? So I think we really need to think about where do we want to go if the economy recovers. Increasing gas prices, you know, a lot of people are saying this is actually a very good time to increase the gas tax. We've got the inactivity epidemic, the growing awareness that quality of life is an economic engine. People are seeking walkable communities every week in the mass media, whether it be USA Today or Time and Newsweek. There's articles pointing out how the housing market is changing. People are seeking more urban, more walkable environments. And of course, all the environmental issues that we just talked about. So we really have an opportunity here to kind of slow down, think about where we want to go for the next generation. So just to summarize, complete streets, sensitive to the community, serve the adjacent land users, serve everyone who will potentially use the street. And I do apologize for having barreled through that so incredibly fast, but you know, between Delta Airlines, Continental Airlines, the weather, silly pilot rules, you know, when I heard that, I said, oh, I'll wake them up, give them a good strong cup of coffee, get me on the plane right now. So, we are going to have a little bit of an exercise I'm going to put you through, but let's take questions and discussion. Like I said, I went through this pretty fast so we could have some questions. And then who's the videographer here? Did he step out? I assume I'll have to he's okay. I'll repeat the question then, yeah. So go ahead, sir, yes.
Well, I was going to ask you a question and you answered it. So.
Well, ask it again anyhow. That way, you know, people aren't. Oh, there is a microphone.
Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah. Yeah. And you look very good from behind, I'm sure. The camera's in the back, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the street in Vancouver. The question I was going to ask was, if you happened to take that picture at a time when there were 4 cars on that road and no bus and no cyclist, would you still
Did you say more cars?
Yeah, say you just happened to take...
Oh, right, I see what you're saying, yeah.
You'd call that a complete street. And
well, yeah, because, I mean, let's face it, highways that carry traffic, this time there's no traffic on it whatsoever. No one says, well, why did you build that highway? There's no one out there. You can go out there at 2 a.m., right? And so...
Well, my question was, I was going to say earlier, you answered my question by saying it's in the context. When I was thinking of that, if you happened to take that when it was filled with cars and nothing else, how would you know it was a complete street?
Right. Well, it's interesting because I remember taking quite a few pictures of this street, and this was like around, late morning, I remember, in November, weather was worse than here, and you can see, you know, how people are dressed. And I'd be willing to say that if you randomly took 20 photos throughout the day, so every half hour or so you took a photo, I'd say you'd get pretty much the scene every time. Yeah, so people are using it. That's a really good point, because there are many streets that have been built that look complete, that got all the facilities, and no one is using them, except cars, drivers. So you got to ask yourself, what are the other factors that are keeping people away from the streets?
Right, that's my next question, because it's, to me, sometimes it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. If you're thinking about how do I design a community that will foster these types of behaviors,
right.
In this case, I think that type of behavior is because of the community, not because of the street per se.
Well, there's both. It's more than just chicken and egg. It's also context that surrounds the street, too. And Vancouver has relatively high density. It's got one factor that we don't really like to talk about too openly in our discussions about complete streets, but we have to be really honest about very expensive and restricted parking, right? A good grid system. Very good mixed use. Vancouver's really gone out of its way in the last 20 years or so to ensure that, for example, families can live in town. They've opened, when they started their planning about 20 years ago, they actually pre-planned where the schools were going to be, right? So all these other factors that foster walking and bicycling and transit use are already in place, yes. So If you don't have those, for example, a friend of mine moved from Gainesville to Boulder, and Gainesville is a college town, about the size of Boulder, got a lot of similarities, and there's a heck of a lot more walking and biking and transit use in Boulder than there is in Gainesville. So we often talk about what are the factors that make such a difference, and we always come back to Gainesville has an amazing amount of free and very cheap parking that kind of works against it. So yeah, there are other factors.
Yeah, because that was the next part of my question is what can you do to try and get that kind of thing started? I think it feeds itself once it gets going. So
right.
I mean, and I work for the city, so that's where I'm coming from.
Right.
What can I do to help get that kind of behavior on a street like that may not have it already?
Well, you do start with the street. At the end, I'll finish up with a series of slides that show a street transformation that includes changes in land use on the sides. But Complete Streets really is aimed at the streets. And the workshop last week in Rutgers, someone came up to me and said, do you know of any complete street policies that include the building code, like, for example, a form-based code or things like that? And it turns out that, I can't remember, Montclair, New Jersey, which has one of the most progressive complete streets policies in the country now, is actually considering expanding it beyond the right-of-way so that it does foster the kind of environment in which just changing the street is not enough. You do need to change the look and feel of what surrounds the street. Yes?
In the designing of complete streets, how do you deal with the often competing demands of transit use and bicycle lanes? Because often, as where you have the case of buses wanting to pull to the curb to discharge
right.
and pick up passengers, often they're cutting right across the bicycle lanes.
That's right. Yes. That's true. No, I mean, that is literally my answer. I'm not being facetious or anything like that. I mean, there's some sharing that's going on. A complete street doesn't mean everyone gets their dedicated space that never gets infringed upon by anyone else. And so when we talk about, bicyclists talk about sharing lanes and things like that. Well, if we design a bike lane and transit uses it from time to time, I say, great, more power to them. Yeah. You do get that leapfrogging problem that occurs. That is that if you look at the average speed of a bicyclist and a bus, it's about the same. The difference is the bicyclist progressors would like to progress at a fairly steady rate of 12 to 15 miles an hour. The bus accelerates to 35 miles an hour, slows down, stops for passengers, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, complete streets will not resolve that issue unless you got such a busy thoroughfare you have a dedicated bus lane, like BRT, for example. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Similar sharing question. In the old days on a totally shared street, bicycles were vehicles, they went on the right, passengers on the left facing traffic. At least that's the way I grew up and was taught.
Passengers on the left.
Pedestrians. Pedestrians.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, me
traffic.
confused. Is he from England or Australia, this guy? What is he talking about? Okay.
Bicycles on the right with traffic.
Right.
Pedestrians on the left against traffic.
That's on a roadway with no sidewalks or shoulders.
Totally
yes.
shared street.
Right.
No sidewalks, no bike paths, no anything.
Right.
Do those kind of rules still apply when
we don't.
shared space?
Yes.
Or
put it this way. I can think of
complete streets
right.
change any of those kind of rules?
Right. Todd, we had a great discussion on the way down. We touched on all these subjects. As Todd brought up the Uniform Vehicle Code, which, by the way, is absolutely moot. It's dead and defunct. Every state is up to its own now. Do state laws have to change for complete streets regarding the vehicle code? Maybe in some instances, but I really can't think of many. I do know that, sad news here for you guys in Virginia, Virginia's a bit of an outlier when it comes to its pedestrian right-of-way laws. You've got some really bizarre things going on in Virginia. And the former bike ped coordinator, David, I can't remember his name, replaced by Jacob Helmholtz, right? He was working on that. He and I collaborated quite a bit on it. But I don't see how anything in the current vehicle codes prevents you from doing complete street designs. And then if you find out there's something in the vehicle code that makes it a little bit awkward, like maybe buses stopping in a bus lane or something like that, that can be tweaked later, but I don't see any compatibility right now.
Now, you may have answered this question already before I arrived here, and please excuse me for arriving.
I was late too, so you were definitely excused, yeah.
All right, thank you. However, how would you suggest that one goes about promoting this to either a city or a general region that they live in? the complete streets idea, that is.
How do we promote it? Okay, yeah, I understand the question now. Good question. Well, first of all, with workshops like this, but usually the process has been this. Just so you know, what we're doing tonight is a really, really condensed workshop that reflects usually a full day workshop. And we actually have 3 of them. And usually what happens is the community itself express interest. There are citizens, elected officials, advocates in the community that are not happy with the way streets are. They've heard about complete streets, so they talk to elected officials, their engineers and all that, and there seems to be some interest, and they don't really know how to proceed, so they will contact the Complete Streets Coalition, get some guidance, for example. And just from information that's off the web and emails and phone conversations, there's about 2 or 3 people staffing the office. Some jurisdictions do pretty well on their own, and they see what other cities are doing and how they adopt a complete street policy, and they just do it with a little or minimal help from us. Others realize, well, they're kind of struggling, and then they turn to us to ask for one of our workshops. And yes, this is my sales pitch. I'm a salesman, right? And there's 3 workshops that we offer. The first one is the introductory workshop, laying the foundation. So we come to a community. We do a little bit of what we're doing here today, just explaining how complete streets work, foster interest and all that, enable people to walk away with a much better understanding of complete streets and enthusiasm to carry it through. And oftentimes communities, that's the last we hear from them, and then 2 years later, send us an email, hey, guess what? We adopted a complete streets policy. The second step is what we call the adoption workshop, and that is there is interest in complete streets, and they've expressed their desire. They understand it, they have trouble crafting a policy. So again, we do a workshop that's more geared at the end of the workshop, at least have a draft policy. Then the third one is the community's already done these 2 steps. They're enthusiastic, they want to complete streets, they adopted a policy, and then 2 or 3 years later, they realize, hey, nothing has changed. You're still building streets that are incomplete, and that's the implementation workshops. What stages do we need to carry out? But even, like I said, I'm doing a bit of sales pitch for our workshops here, but even absent those are 3 basic steps. Enthusiasm, adopt a policy, and implement it, right? And the implementation is definitely the more challenging one.
Michael, thank you for persevering and getting here today.
Yeah, you heard about all my travails, yeah.
I've got...
Oh, you're Bruce. Yeah. Oh man. Hey, I passed up on eating at the Beach Bully. The name is so intriguing, man.
That's a real carnivore's place.
It's okay. I'm not a vegetarian.
The question I have is that it seems here with our localities that the communities understand this, maybe not necessarily in the name Complete Streets, but with what they're asking for, particularly with community input on comprehensive plans, surveys and things that the localities do. Our planners for the localities seem to understand it very, very well and are amenable to incorporate, developing plans and things that take us in this direction. I've had reports recently, even the medical community is getting on board. They're
public health has been such a strong ally.
And medical seminars and things, and talking about the built environment
and
the impact of that on our health. The one place we haven't seen this, though, as a profession as a whole, and I'm not picking on any individual here or any one locality, but that's our civil engineers.
Right.
They have not embraced this or been very, very slow to. And I just wondered, as someone from that profession, how do you see it from that side?
Okay, great question. And it's interesting. Usually the way you frame the question is the way we most often hear it, but it's not necessarily always true. You've probably heard the expression of 3-legged stool, right? 1 or 2 legs, you fall over. 4 legs, it gets kind of rocky, right? So you need 3 legs for a stool to be well balanced. And the 3-legged stool in this context applies to citizen advocates, the community, right, as a whole, expressing a desire for change. Elected officials, which enact that change from a policy or legislative point of view, and then staff that has to carry it out. Not just complete streets. If you think of anything in the built environment that happens in a democratic society, that's the basic 3-pronged approach, right? And the way you express your frustration, it's interesting you didn't mention the elected officials, but usually the frustration is aimed at one of the 3, and I'd say more often than not staff. But it's not necessarily the case. I can give you plenty of examples where the leaders in the community have been like elected officials. They're ahead of their own citizenry to get elected, and people don't realize, well, I didn't realize I elected someone who's even thinking further than I am, right? And there are actual examples of communities where it has been staff that has led the way. The community that I lived in for almost 30 years, Corvallis, Oregon, is a really interesting one because they've just always had, they've had pretty strong citizen input, don't get me wrong, but they just always had amazing staff, and it's just incredible what Corvallis has done in the last 30 years or so, because staff really gets it. And you've heard the expression, ask for forgiveness instead of permission, right? They've done stuff that I wouldn't say was against policy, the elected officials would not have approved anyhow. So there's one example where the staff was totally on board. And our Complete Streets instructors, there's about 20 of us, include 7 or 8 civil engineers, actually quite a few PTOEs, that's traffic operation engineers, and ITE, the Institute for Transportation Engineers, has adopted Complete Streets as its mantra too, and some of the manuals that are coming out of ITE are really incredible. Like I said, AASHTO supports it. So the reluctance could be, a lot of it is just inertia. You know, you've heard the famous, this way we've always done it. Or, well, I'm under pressure to move cars, right? Or liability is another one that's often expressed. And last week, I keep referring to this because the last Complete Streets workshop that I did was in Rutgers last week in New Jersey. And we had a very good noontime presentation by a couple of attorneys talking about liability and just blowing out of the water, just basically saying, you know, if your job is to build roads and you got a complete policy and those roads have to include facilities for pedestrians and bicyclists, you're not liable because that's what you're asked to do, you know. So if in your case it's staff, then that's what you need to work on. And like I said, we have a lot of tools that can help you make the case with engineers and planners that it's the right thing to do.
More of an observation than a
Sure.
question. I wonder if we have the paradigm backwards.
If we what?
If we have a paradigm backwards.
Yeah, good to hear that, yeah.
Almost every interstate highway I've driven on has a nice wide shoulder.
Right.
It's plenty wide for a bicycle, a car, a horse. Only problem is you have to be a motorized vehicle to drive on there. Then we come off of our interstates and we don't have anything where we're talking about doing something similar with complete streets. So
That's a very good observation. And the misunderstanding about shoulders is, and like I said, I was fortunate to work for DOT, Oregon, that very early on, back in the 1940s, adopted a pretty strong shoulder policy because early research showed that highways with shoulders have fewer crashes. And Wisconsin is another one too, and you go all over the southeast, they have pretty major highways with no shoulders whatsoever, right? And so the shoulder standards that are in AASHTO have nothing to do with bicyclists. They have to do with traffic volumes and speeds, and you're right. On the interstate, it's 10 feet. So when people say, oh, look at all the money they're spending on bicycles with those shoulders, again, pointing to staff often opens up the design guidelines from AASHTO, and they said, well, given these conditions, these are the shoulders we should be putting on these roadways. And one more point about shoulders. Recent research on travel lane width has showed there's really no safety benefit whatsoever with wider lanes versus narrow lanes. And some jurisdictions, actually one on the left here, a county, Benton County, Oregon, has adopted this standard, 10-foot travel lanes and 6-foot shoulders. And they're much safer than wider travel lanes with no shoulders, yeah. So it is an interesting paradox, it seems like, yeah. Yes, sir. Now you got the microphone. You got to say something.
You alluded to a issue which I've wondered about myself. I am a city employee, but I remember when we were so excited that there appeared to be a complete streets policy with VDOT, which was, I think, was 2005. Maybe you said 7 years ago. Yeah. And then we've wondered why nothing has happened. We haven't been able to get our own our engineers to implement those policies, and it sounds like you have some answer to that. So you can
actually, I plead the fifth on that one. We did a series of workshops 3 years ago sponsored by VDOT. Yep, we did one in Roanoke, one in way south Henry County. I can't remember. Then one in more northern Virginia. Not exactly suburban D.C., but we did 3 throughout. What's interesting, I'm pretty thin ice here because, VDOT was my client then, what was really interesting is that all the workshops, the city staff turned out in droves. A few VDOT representatives came out, and the most interesting workshop was definitely Roanoke, and Roanoke was going full bore ahead, and they just lost patience. Said, well, we'll adopt our own complete streets policy. And I don't have any documentation for it yet, but we think a few cities have adopted complete streets policy that apply to all streets, which includes the DOT in their state. So even though this is not Virginia, yes, a hypothetical state, if a city in that state adopts a complete streets policy and says it applies to all roads and streets, it can almost force the hand of the DOT. And so we know of a few states, one in the Midwest that starts with M and rhymes with Dakota, but isn't one of the Dakotas, Minnesota, was kind of reluctant for a long time, and the Complete Streets Coalition worked with Blue Cross Blue Shield, interestingly enough. We did a series of workshops all throughout the state, but with cities and counties, and they were adopting complete streets policies left and right, and Minnesota DOT said, all right, fine. Maybe they got so ahead of them, right? So that's about the best comment I can make on that. If you think this is important to you in Virginia Beach, go for it. And since VDOT has the policy, if you have a project where a DOT highways slated for some kind of construction in your community, and you got your policy, you know, that's two swords you've got in your sheath that you can use, 2 arrows, yeah.
Hi. I represent a group of cyclists called the Virginia Beach Alley Cats. You may have heard of the Alley Cats in Oregon. It's a strong movement there. But
Actually, I haven't, but...
You haven't?
No.
Well, I actually used to belong to another group of Alley Cats in Louisiana, where you just came from. So I know that they have a growing grassroots presence in the United States. But basically, we are committed to the community, giving back. We build bikes for underprivileged kids.
Yeah.
We also do community involvement, more along the lines of just sort of getting people more aware of bikes and what bikes can do for the community. And at our last meeting, we were talking about bike advocacy, and actually this scenario raised a few concerns because the bike lanes that are starting to be implemented in Virginia Beach, I think it's on Dam Neck or London Bridge, one of the two. It is this condition where you have a shoulder, and the shoulders are just filled with debris and glass and whatnot. So we're concerned that that's going to be the scenario, and that's all we can hope for when it does us no good when it's going to pop our tire every time.
And which is why good complete streets policy includes all phases of transportation, including maintenance. And that was interesting. Getting back to liability, one of the points that those attorneys made last week was very clear. Jurisdictions are rarely liable for design. Sovereign immunity applies there, but maintenance is what gets you. And there's no doubt that if you adopt a complete streets policy and you do include facilities for the more benign modes of transportation, walking and bicycling, you probably are increasing your liability a little bit because you have to maintain them to a standard so that they're usable. So if they were designed to usable standard, but then left to fall into disrepair, then you do have a bit of a liability. There's no doubt about that. I actually, the city where I worked in was my career, Salem, Oregon. A friend of mine, Chuck, became the bike ped program manager about 15 years ago, and he enthusiastically pursued bike lane restriping so fast the city maintenance couldn't quite keep up. And I said to him, you probably should slow down and make sure you got the maintenance budget up to par. Just to give you an example, Corvallis, Oregon sweeps its streets with bike lanes 5 times a month, more than once a week, right? I recently moved to Switzerland. Flat tires are unheard of. The only time a friend of mine got a flat, we found out it was defect in his rim. There's no glass on the roads. There's no debris. They're just sweeping them all the time, right? So it does involve that kind of commitment. Now, politically, from a funding perspective, that's interesting because maintenance is sorely neglected. I always like to point out that, politicians rarely cut a yellow ribbon for a new sweeper, right? Or dedicating more budget to that very mundane task of fixing potholes and things like that. So again, remember what I said at the beginning, funding drives policy? So much of our funding is geared towards big capital improvement projects. We tend to forget, if we stop building anything new, you've heard the American Society for Civil Engineers has given our infrastructure a D, right? Because of lack of maintenance. So see what you can do to steer more funding and resources to maintenance. Okay, okay, one more, then we'll.
I'm actually an ODU student, soon to be graduating in geography and GIS. And I had a question about a street near my house in Norfolk. Oh, by the way, you're more than welcome to come to Norfolk if you'd like.
Well, that's what I flew into, yeah. Bring me back.
The street by my house is similar to that one. It's really wide. It's one lane each way.
Which one, the left or the right?
The one on the right, where the child on the bike.
I consider that a pretty narrow street for a main street, but anyhow, yeah.
Well, this street, it's one lane each way. There's parking is allowed on the side, but even with parking, there's still just a little bit room where someone can ride a bike. My concern is I'm trying to get a civic lead to okay some type of stripe, but how would you put down a stripe to designate a bike lane? Because I'm concerned with people opening car doors.
Right. Let me ask you this: you know how wide your street is?
It's the Bayview Street. It's wide. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, I find that so fascinating.
It's really wide for a one lane each way.
Right. I mean, you go to Utah and you talk about a 40-foot street. They say, well, that's a skinny street. You go to Boston, you talk about, or Rhode Island, you talk about a 30-foot street. So, well, that's a wide street. So it's a little bit hard for me to judge out of context. But is it a residential street or?
It's a residential street, and there's ample parking for side parking on each side.
And are people using the parking?
Yes, but not all.
No, yeah. I mean, on-street parking is one of the best things you can do to slow traffic down and make it better for all users, right? But it has to be used, otherwise you get too wide a street. I would actually, striping is probably not going to help. It actually can work against you. One of the things that I'm really pushing for is getting rid of center lines. Center lines do far more harm than good. And so you want to create some kind of confusion if you can. And I just came back from spending 2 days in Lambertville, New Jersey. Great little community. And I was pretty astonished to see that their second most important street that parallels the state highway carries pretty high traffic. They told me about 6,000 to 7,000 vehicles a day with on-street parking, 32 feet curb to curb, no stripes, which means they're basically sharing about a 16 to 17 foot wide lane in the middle, two ways, no striping. And I saw lots of bicyclists using the street. So the magic is to get the speeds down. Yeah. Okay. Great. So yeah, this is the way we anticipated. Good. Anything else before we move on to the second one? Because that's kind of a design question that I realized maybe we can answer in the third one here. So I do want to put you to work. And I do want to go through this next one right here. Talk a little bit about design, and then, yeah, I actually switch over. We'll talk a little bit about design, and then we'll open up to performance measures and do that final exercise. I thought, well, no, actually, yeah, let's do it this way then, yeah. Yeah, actually, we can maybe answer your question at the end of this. Even though there's no way, no how, in just 15 minutes or so, I'm going to be able to talk about all the design elements that create complete streets, what I want to do is thinking about how we can retrofit streets, how we can get more out of our streets with maybe a little bit of additional funding, but without widening the streets. I mean, we've just gone on a street widening orgy in this country for about 50 years, and it, like I said, imagine that extended out the next 50 years. It's unimaginable, right? So my good friend Ian Lockwood, I don't know if you heard of him, he's an engineer who's got not only a sense of humor, but fantastic drawing skills, as you can see, right? Like a great political cartoonist. And a few years ago, he came out with a white paper about loaded engineering terms. And he said, whenever the public works, the DOT says, we're going to improve your street, scream, run for shelter, right? Because it usually means widening, and I don't think it means an improvement for this woman right here, right? So we're going to look at, how can we incorporate a lot of these features without widening the street? And the answer is very simple: Photoshop. This is my stepson does a lot of Photoshop. He did this one right here, but we do a lot of this coming into communities. And next week, Dan Burden, if you come, he's going to just show you some amazing photos. A lot of them have been done my stepson. And you can see that, again, defined wide, but to me this is a fairly wide street. It is one way, and obviously it's not operating at capacity, right? And with creative restriping, not just the bike lane, you see the curbs were moved in on the left, the planter strip was put in, more trees. It's amazing how much you can do within what's already out there. Some parts of the country have very, very wide streets. I came from Louisiana where the streets are very wide. Other parts of the country, like the Northeast, streets are narrower, there's no doubt about that. But you got to look at what you have and how you're using it. Would you say this is an efficient use of space? No, very inefficient. Does anyone know how this street ranks according to the Highway Capacity Manual as far as level of service? A, right? This is considered an A. I give the street an F. It's ridiculous, right? To have all that pavement out there and not have it being used. Anyone familiar with this street here? Probably the most famous street in the world, the Champs-Élysées in Paris. About the same right-of-way, right? Would you say this is a successful street? Yeah, and yet the Highway Capacity Manual gives this an F because it's congested all the time, right? So you need to start rethinking about some of these assumptions that we make, and is congestion necessarily a bad thing? And do we want our streets to be empty most of the time so we can get traffic moving through them at the peak hour, or do we want to think more in terms of what do we have in the way of space and how can we put it to better use? And traditionally, the way we do highway design in this country is what we call from the center line out. The center line is both that yellow stripe on the road, but it's also on plans and diagrams where you put the middle of your roadway and you work your way out. And we're saying for complete streets, that's actually backwards because you're really favoring the auto mode by looking at the automobile first. And in this example, this is pretty extreme. It's very, very wide. It's taken somewhere in the Midwest. And they went to the maximums. They looked at the AASHTO guide, and the AASHTO guide says, a center turn lane can be anywhere from 10 to 16 feet. Well, let's just use 16 feet, right? And they say travel lanes can be anywhere from 9 to 12 feet. Well, let's use 12. And then the AASHTO guide says, well, you might want a side distance up against the curb. Side distance can be from 2 to 4 feet. Well, let's use 4 feet, right? Let's just always use the highest, which is very common practice. So these are the dimensions that you have. It pretty much fills up the right-of-way. You can see the skinny sidewalk on the right. So then those pesky complete streets advocates say, hey, wait a minute. Didn't we adopt a complete streets policy that says on a road project like this, you should include bikeways and sidewalks? And the answer is, yeah, but we'd have to purchase right-of-way because the right-of-way got all used up. And of course, on a diagram, if you added bike lanes and sidewalks, they look like that at the edges. They're obviously the culprits, right? So what we propose is, how about you did it the other way around? You work from the outside in. That's what context-sensitive design is all about. You look at the context, you look at your policy, and you say, well, we adopted a policy, sidewalks. We like to have 6-foot sidewalks. We really do like our trees. There's many reasons to have a buffer, furniture zone out there. And this kind of street, we like to have 8 feet. This street carries enough traffic. We think we should have bike lanes. We adopted 6 foot as a bike lane standard, and you add it all up, and we have 22 feet left over. Well, I guess the driveways, cars are going to be 22 feet, 211s. I'm being a little bit facetious, like I was in the previous example, right? But that really is the way that it works. You work from the outside in, see what you got left over, and then work your way back out again, basically looking at balancing all the needs. So you really do need to start thinking in terms of design from the outside in rather from the inside out with complete streets. And then that also, obviously, takes context-sensitive design into consideration. So if you look at, does the road look familiar to you, right? Who's heard the term generica? I mean, the streets are the same all over the country, right? And you can see what an awful road this is. It is, fairly wide, not super wide. And just look at how it could be transformed if you do look at the room that's out there and what you can add without taking any more right-of-way, just by narrowing the lanes. I mean, look at all, I'll give you one more time. This is obviously Photoshop. You can tell it's Photoshop because the grass is so green, right? I'd like to see someone put in a bit of dying grass in their Photoshop renderings and trees with a little bit of blight on them, So, look, wider sidewalks, planter strips, bike lanes, planted raised median with dedicated turn lanes, simply by narrowing the travel lanes. They recaptured this all from the existing space. So the next step, of course, is road diets. Who here has heard the term road diet before coming here? Right, this is taking it even one step further, and that's actually losing some travel lanes and dedicating the space to something else. Like in this example right here, here's the concept. This is in Charlotte, North Carolina. And here's the existing, here's the concept, and here's the actual. Like I said, the grass is greener in front but it's dying on the island. Okay, good catch. So anyhow, you can see that by looking at the space that we have out there and how much has been dedicated to travelways for automobiles, it's just amazing how streets can be transformed and the space dedicated to what we call a higher and better use. Here's a great example from Pottstown, Pennsylvania. Fairly unusual cross-section, a suburban cross-section, 5 lanes with parallel parking on both sides on a main street, a very wide main street. It was repaved, and look at all these changes that they made, right? Removed the travel lane in each direction, put in bike lanes, changed the parking on one side from parallel to diagonal. You notice what kind of diagonal parking? Right? Who's heard of back-in diagonal parking? Right. What would the advantage be? What would the advantage be of back-in diagonal parking over conventional pull-in? Right, exactly. Right. When you're actually pulling into moving traffic, you can see. With conventional diagonal parking, you've got a perfectly good view of the curb in front of you when you pull in, and you've got to back out into traffic. And obviously much better for bicyclists. There's a lot of other advantages. But the important point of this slide is, yeah, those transformations are important, but the fact that they took advantage of a pavement overlay project. So complete streets, a lot of people associate, like I said, with capital improvement projects. No, you need to look at your maintenance program. What can you do with restriping, minor changes without any road widening whatsoever? There's a couple of other reasons why it's so important to do it as part of an overlay program. One, it costs you absolutely nothing more. You don't have to do with a stripe removal, which can be very expensive. Politically, it's sometimes easier to get a lot done than just a little done. For some things, you want baby steps. There's also an expression that says this: when jumping over a canyon, don't do it in 2 steps. So some things you really got to do all at once, right? And just be brave and do it. If they'd lobbied for just one of those things and it failed, they wouldn't have got the other 2, right? One-way streets. I don't know how many one-way streets you have down here, but most one-way streets are way under capacity. They simply take a 2-way street, replace them with the same number of lanes all in one direction, and there's a lot of underutilized space out there. This is one of my favorite examples here. This is the Broadway-Weidler couplet in Portland. It was 4 lanes. It was a couplet, 4 lanes in each direction, a very dysfunctional street. It was pretty much dying. In 1991, they restriped it, part of an overlay project, and brought it down to 3 lanes, put in the bike lanes, put the on-street parking back in, which gave them opportunities to put in street trees and curb extensions, and the street has taken on a whole new life now. There is a little bit more congestion at the peak hour in the morning and the evening, but the rest of the time the street works so much better, right? So when you're thinking in terms of how a street is used, we need to be thinking in terms of 24/7, which is literally 168 hours a week. In the traditional way we do transportation planning and forecasting for the peak hour in the morning and the peak hour in the evening, that's 10 hours a week. That leaves 158 hours where the street is not fulfilling its potential. Intersections, too. Complete streets, really, a few complete streets policies deal with crossings and intersections. So you take an intersection like this, and thanks to Photoshop, you really make a much safer environment for people walking through this intersection. This is this is the land of the absurdly wide streets, and this is what they're planning to build throughout their community. And one of the main reasons why we have wide streets, it's not because the streets need to carry the amount of traffic that they do, is because at intersections we're stopping traffic half the time, and you need to widen the intersections because of all the stacking, and then it's just easier to carry that cross-section all the way through. So if you replace it with a roundabout, for example, you can carry so much more traffic at an intersection, so much more efficiently. Look at the roads approaching them. You see how much narrower the roads are, right? So even though people say that roundabouts cost more than a signal and maybe take more right-of-way, in this case it doesn't, but look how much less right-of-way you need down the street. So again, you need to be thinking in terms of systems and connectivity and how this all ties together. So again, rethinking the role of urban streets in this always chasing level of service and congestion, it's an absolute losing battle. You've heard this cliche, you can't build your way out of congestion, and you really got to worry, is that really the goal? I mean, I just made this quip the other day, it came to mind. I'm not bashing traffic engineers, but traffic engineering profession is the only profession that I know of that's asked to solve the very problems it created, right? I'd like to think doctors don't go around making people sick for business, right? Plumbers don't poke holes in pipes so you come back. They come back, right? With traffic engineering, it kind of is that way. It is a self-perpetuating vicious cycle of always widening roads to try to improve the level of service, to become more congested, right? So we need to stop thinking in terms of that's the only goal for a road project. And this is a fascinating chart, and I'd like to see the numbers for 09. VMTs, vehicle miles traveled, are measured at the regional level, at the city level, the personal level per capita, right? And they're also collected nationally. So this is the absolute total number of miles driven on all U.S. highways, that's all roads and streets and highways in this country by everybody. It's literally in the trillions. Those are billions on the left, right? So 1,000 billion is a trillion, very big numbers. And it is absolutely true. For the last 15 to 20 years or so, traffic forecasters could look back in the rearview mirror and say, yep, this is how much traffic has increased in the last 15 years, projected 15 years in the future, guess what we're going to get? So there's that self-fulfilling prophecy. A lot of people are saying, well, just by the fact that you built roads, you're getting more traffic. But look at when it started leveling off. Before the gas prices started peaking in 07, 08, and before the economy took a downturn. And the numbers for 09 are telling us that it's continuing to decrease. In Louisiana, I'll get you in just a second, we looked at a street project, Bolton Avenue in Alexandria, and the DOT traffic engineer showed me the numbers. It was pretty interesting. She had them going back to the mid-90s. It was 14,000, 15,000, 16,000, 15,000, 14,000, like every 5 or 6 years, 13,000, 12,000. So it started to go up, and then it just went back down again. It's now 2,000 less than 15 years ago, which makes it 7,000 or 8,000 less than what the predictor would have been had you just straight lined it, right? There's many reasons for this. One of them is, in my opinion, there's just so many hours in a day that people can drive, right? And I mean, think about it, right? How much more driving can we do? It's not related to population growth either, necessarily. So we need to stop thinking in terms of we need to continuously widen our roads. We need to put them to higher and better use. So, yeah, go ahead, your question?
The flat spot in 1990, is that an anomaly?
Oh, yeah. I couldn't tell you. I mean, a straight line is the best fit. You know, this is, statistically speaking, most statisticians tell you, wow, that's the straightest line I've ever seen by just stringing numbers together over the years. Yeah, that's, I mean, this is very, very unfortunate, but if you look at bicycle fatalities, for example, for any given state, they jump up and down like this. And so you can easily say, wow, look at that, bicycle fatalities doubled from 2001 to 2002. Oh my gosh, what are we doing? And then 2003, they went down to levels below 2002. So most trends are very spiky. This is really quite flat, yeah. So again, you know, you got to think in terms of all the uses you can have for a street, right? And not just mobility, as important that is, but also access. If you really think about it, the purpose of a trip is to access goods and services and information. I mean, you all got here, right? Somehow. So you were mobile to get here, and yet I'd like to think it was to access this information and to share with your friends. A thriving economy, right? It's people walking into stores with wallets who spend money. I mean, even though you have drive-thrus, there are people in those cars, most cases. Why this rush to develop the driverless car? You know, several universities and big corporations are pushing for the driverless car. It's got to make sense in someone's minds, right? What?
You can't Google while you drive. They're the ones that are developing the automated cars. So now
Yeah, okay. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I like that one a lot. Okay, thank you. I'll pin my hat on that one. Yeah. Beauty, aesthetics, right? And we don't bring enough landscape architects into the realm of street design too. These are all important values that streets have. So, like I said, just a quick open, yeah. We do, I just got done doing a 3-day design course. I'm not going to cover all of that in just 10 minutes or so, but any questions about just some of these ideas as far as design and how you can create complete streets with the resources that you have, not going out and seeking a whole lot of new funding and new space for these features. Yeah, come to the microphone, remember? Yeah, you see, you raised your hand, but he got to the microphone. You got to get up. Go ahead.
Are there, a lot of this is focused on, you know, sort of the physical components of actually building, restriping, things like that. What about the operational components, particularly with respect to things like speed limits, traffic calming?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the word should be self-explanatory. Complete streets policies is not just the design, it is the operation, no doubt about it. And for example, making sure the pedestrian push buttons respond to pedestrians, loop detectors that pick up bicyclists. So for example, your signal crews should be made aware of it, that wherever they tinker around with a signal, there's a requirement now for pedestrian countdowns, for example, on all signals in the new manual, right? So if they're going out there making change to a signal, make sure they put in the countdowns, make sure that the push buttons and all are accessible, loop detectors, they pick up bicycling, maintenance, for example. Yeah, so again, I don't know what your street looks like, but is the speed appropriate? What can you do to bring the speeds down? So if you can't get a dedicated bicycle facility, bringing the speeds down, make it more likely that it can work in a shared use condition. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, the Seattle policy is the one that addresses that the best. Yeah, operations. Yes.
How long does the research usually take to implement these designs, or are you saying it's already done?
Well, what implement? What, I mean, new designs, or?
For instance, when you said that some of these streets went on road diets.
Oh God, that is okay. Here's what I say about research. We could stop doing. Academics won't like this. We could stop doing research in the next 10 years and take those resources that we would have spent and start implementing what we've learned in the last 20. Road diets have been studied to death. Iowa's been studying it for 30 years now. Kittleson came out with a report 2-3 years ago. Rosales, I can't remember her first name anymore. Really good compendium on road diet research. UNC, University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center, has been doing research on road diets. If there's any hesitation whatsoever, it's just an excuse. I often say we need more research. It's just code for, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess maybe I phrase it incorrectly. I mean, like the traffic studies, et cetera, that are needed to.
Yeah, and again, those are often excuses if you really think that congestion is the #1 problem and the #1 issue you need to solve, then yeah, traffic studies become a big thing. But if you want to be more like Vancouver and say, how about we just build a livable community, and if there's congestion, so be it. Vancouver is congested, don't get me wrong. And they have people coming in there all the time from like the Cato Institute and other places saying, well, you got a congestion problem, you got to solve it. I think, you know that, I don't know if you know that, I don't know if the name Robert Moses rings a bell, but he went around the country in the 60s. He died in the 70s, and he had plans for cities like Portland and other places with freeways tearing through them saying, you got a congestion problem. So it's more of what do you value, what do you want, where do you want to be, and let traffic happen. Yeah. Okay, great. Do one more real quick one. I think we're doing pretty good here as far as time goes. And I changed the order purposely because I kind of wanted to set up the premise here for performance measures, and then we'll do kind of a combined exercise so we can finish close to on time. There you go. Performance measures. In every field where we endeavor to make a change to either the environment or to social norms or whatever that we think is better, public health is very good at this, we want to find a way of measuring, are we being successful, right? It's like with tobacco cessation, the last 40 years, public health can say, wow, people are smoking less, and they got the data to back it up, right? So that was a desirable outcome of the tobacco cessation efforts that started 50 years ago. It's measured, not as successful as I'd like to hope, but still, we got a good measure, right? In transportation, we use all kinds of measures. To create a different type of environment for people using streets, and I think your question kind of leads to that, we need to have different measures. And the cities that are succeeding are not using traffic as their only measure of success. Think about this. For basically anything that you do as a human being that's experiential, where you want to try to get some pleasure, some positive experience out of what it is that you undertake, going to a restaurant, for example, right? These all apply in no particular order. Convenience, right? You want to be fairly conveniently located, easy to find the front door, things like that. Safety, you want to make sure you're not going to get food poisoning, right? Or Cut yourself on the broken glass. Comfort. You don't want the chair falling over. You don't want to be too close to people next to you. You don't want to sit under the air conditioning vent. Access. It's not only a question of is it conveniently located, but do you have a way to access it? Reasonable travel time. You know, you put in your order, the waiter's taking your order, how long will it take for your order to get there, right? Low cost. You know, how much do you want to spend? In Alexandria, we went to a very high-end restaurant, and their entrees were in the $35 to $45 range, so we kind of gulped. Then we saw they got a date special. If you and your date come in, you have a complete dinner for $25. So appetizer, entree, and desserts. I turned to my colleague Michael and said, "Do you want to be my date tonight?" He says, "Yeah, you bet." And reliability. You know, if you order your steak medium rare, you want it to be medium rare, not well cooked, right? And of course, I'm using a restaurant as an example, but in transportation, this is definitely the case right now. Speed is the one that we question. If you think about my trip this morning, okay, convenience, my hotel was pretty close to the airport, called a cab, picked me up, got me to the airport, it was convenient located. Safety, had a good cab driver, I like to think those pilots are well trained, pretty confident. Comfort, travel a lot, got upgraded to first class, cool. Access, the airport was fairly small and convenient and all that once I checked in and everything, right? Reasonable travel time. I got up at 4:30 this morning. I got here at 7 o'clock at night, right? So there was a 1 hour time difference. It took me 13 and a half hours to get here. That was really unreasonable travel time. The cost was really cheap. I just couldn't believe how cheap it was. I got lucky. So where did the system break down? Reliability, right. It was, yeah, there was a big snafu. It became unreliable. I had an awful experience. Remember, I had to rent a car. Okay, you came in a bit later. I had to rent a car and drive to Shreveport. That's where speed became an issue because picked up a rental car about 7:30, got on the road at 20 to 8 to catch a 10 after 10 flight. So speed limit was 70. I normally drive 5 miles an hour below the speed limit. I actually drove 5 miles an hour above the speed limit, got there in plenty of time, but it didn't matter because that plane was full. So it gets back to that reliability, right? The speed at which the plane flew was pretty much irrelevant in this whole equation, right? So it's interesting because if you look at all these factors that really matter to travelers, what the design manuals have focused on, and you talked about that coming in, Todd, is the speed. Let's try to get people traveling faster. Therefore, they'll get to their location quicker. It doesn't work that way, folks. The more you build streets for speed, the longer it takes people to get there. And why is that? Because more people use the streets and you get more congestion, and therefore it takes you longer to get there. And the very paradigm that says, let's build streets that get people fast, has led to the kind of land use that we have, where things are very far apart. Do we spend more or less time than our parents and grandparents in travel? More. Do we have faster vehicles than our grandparents had? Much faster. That's the paradox. The faster we try to go, the more time we spend in traffic. So building higher speed roads does not meet any of these needs, and that's what too much focus has been on in roadway design, is speed. This is not Photoshop. This is very real. This is a road in University Place, Washington, a suburban community outside of Seattle. And this is pretty much what it looked like, Generica. This road was built in the early 70s. Using the guidelines of the time, in the 1990s, they wanted to do something completely different. They brought in Dan Burden, which is interesting. This is one of his photos right here. Completely transformed the street. This is not Photoshop. This is a real before and after. Right? Interestingly enough, using the same design guidelines. As like I pointed out, your question about staff, right? You can build this street or you can build this street using the same design guidelines. So it really depends on the outcomes, what the community says it wants out of its streets, right? So when we look at performance measures and what it is that we value, we need to ask for more than just give us more pavement, give us more capacity. What else could we measure? Here are just a few examples right here. We'll go through them in more detail. This is a case study that we like to use. To answer your question, here's a road diet that was really studied extensively. The reason why is it was a Florida DOT project. It was a street that cuts through Orlando, and they were going to repave it, and Orlando wanted to do something different with it. And they were also negotiating the idea that the city would take over the highway. And Florida agreed to this restriping if Not only the city took it over, but they did some really good before and after studies. And the reason why it's such an important point to make is we don't do enough before studies. It's really hard after you do a project, right, to gather the before information. So this is a concept, it's the reality, it's the reality afterwards. They actually did follow the plan to restripe it to 3 lanes. So look at what they measured. Safety. They look at crashes. Now, remember I talked about millions or billions, no, trillions of vehicle miles traveled, right? Those are unimaginable figures to most people. So the crash rate on the left is the conventional rate of crashes per million vehicle miles traveled. And most people go, huh? I travel 3 miles to go to work. I travel 4 miles to shop go, whatever. I don't know what a million miles mean. So they found a much more eloquent way of expressing it that the public and the media can understand. They had about a crash every 2.5 days, or 146 a year, to a crash every 4 days, 87 per year. So very easy to tell the public and the media and the elected officials, look at that, we cut crashes by about 1/3. That's pretty substantial. Injuries went down by twice as much, cut by 2/3. So about 1 a week or 40 a year to 1 a month, 12 per year. That's pretty dramatic, right? Why do you think injuries went down twice as much as overall crashes? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, slower speeds. Exactly. Exactly. So same kind of crash occurring at a lower speed will lead to a less severe injury. Absolutely. Or maybe no injury. Right. Very good. Speeding. This is an interesting one right here. The measure that they used was not the 85th percentile, which is a measure. There's many other ways of capturing speed. What they looked at, it was posted at 30 miles an hour, is how many people are going 6 miles an hour or more than the posted speed limit. You know, what people would consider maybe an unreasonable speed, right? And it's a fairly long corridor, about 6 miles. So at one end, they reduced it by about half for the high-end speeders, about 16 to 7.5%. The middle people were behaving a little bit better. It was 10%, went down a little bit. The south end, when they had a lot of speeders, it went down more proportionately, right, depending which way you look at these numbers. But this is just to point out that they use a different measure than the conventional 85th percentile, which actually didn't change that much. What's interesting about a road diet, you could actually have the average speed increase. Traffic is going slower, but more regularly, instead of stop and go. So that's an interesting one right there. Traffic volumes went down a little bit, but they went back up to their previous level. And one of the reasons why they go down, you do any construction project, people shy away from it for so long, they're not sure whether they can go back on that road or not. So it really didn't affect capacity. It's quite a lot of traffic to be carrying, just 2 lanes, 1 in each direction, right? This is a way of measuring the economic health of a retail area. There's many other ways of doing it, but this was an easy one to do. On-street parking utilization went from about 30 to 40%, so more people were stopping, patronizing the businesses. More people walking, more people bicycling, right? So these are things that you can capture that most people don't. You know, you just look at, well, you know, did it affect capacity or more people driving down the road? Yeah, people may look at crashes, but they don't parse it out to crashes versus injuries. Does it benefit the community? These are both shopping centers. That's not a prison in the upper one. Okay, those are signs like Best Buy and things like that. You know, which one do you want in your community? These are 2 shopping centers. Right? Anyone votes for the one above? Okay, fine. Don't question other people's tastes. Right? Does the street design reduce crashes? We talk about safety, and yet with so many well-known, researched safety designs just simply aren't being used, like tightening up the radius at a corner, right? Does it treat all travelers fairly? Sure, we have to make sure that the moving van can get into the residential streets when it needs to, but you don't design for the large truck at every radius, otherwise you get cars, like the one on the lower portion, taking that curve way too fast. That is much too big a radius for an urban street, like 60-foot radius down there, right? So you need to look at transportation equity in your designs. You have far more pedestrians than truckers using these streets, right? So the goal really is wise investments that will enhance the entire community, and you achieve that by thinking in terms, what do we want to get out of our streets, right? So again, I'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll bring you to the exercise that I'd like to have you do, so I can take a little bit of a break. Any questions on performance measures? Good? Yeah. You don't have time for the exercise. Okay, good. So, well, maybe, okay, just do it this way then. Okay, instead of, we're going to do a huddle and all that. I mean, apologies for being late. Let's just finish up with that. Just individually then, how about just start thinking in terms of, I gave you quite a few examples right here. If you adopted a complete streets policy and you look at how you want to transform these streets and how they will operate differently and how they may, I'm not saying they will, they may negatively impact the conventional level of service measurement, which means it may be a little bit harder to drive on some of these streets, no doubt about that. You may have to slow traffic down, which in conventional traffic engineering is considered a negative, right? So what kind of positives can you see? And if you want to repeat examples I just gave you, that's just fine. But what kind of positives could you say you'd like to see measured so you can show that, hey, wait a minute, we actually had a positive impact on the communities? I didn't show you everything here that people come up with. Usually do this as a group discussion, so it's easier to talk among yourselves, but just think about it for a minute or two and just volunteer some ideas. Go ahead. Yeah, no, you have to come to the microphone, yeah.
It's been well documented since the 1950s that the more people that you have on the street, it's basically an economic engine for growth and stimulus. So.
Right, okay, so you like to measure the economic impact, right. So the example I gave you just gave on-street parking utilization. That's actually a fairly weak measure, but yeah, so measure the success of the street by the number of people on the street and shopping and things like that, yeah. And just so you know, in a minute, I'll show you what different communities have come up with. That's always in the top three that people ask for. Economic health, economic vitality, right? And just to give you an idea of ways that people measure it, this is one I would never thought of. In Montana, someone came up with this because people wonder, well, it could take years to get the records, and there's sales tax receipts and things like that. And someone said, oh, there's a much easier way of doing it. How's that? Call the garbage company and ask how many businesses they're picking, how many new customers they get. And no one ever thought of that. And say, yeah, you can get that information within a couple of months. They'll tell you how many more garbage pickups we got. Anyone else? Go ahead.
As far as adopting complete streets, Norfolk right now is about midstream in a new comprehensive plan. Is it easier to do the policy standalone, or could it be incorporated in a...
Oh, absolutely, yes. I showed you a slide showing the 6 different ways, at least 6, maybe more, of adopting a complete streets policy, and one is in the comp plan. There's no doubt about that. It doesn't have to be a standalone. It is the weakest of the 6, because even though, sorry planners, it is a planning document, it often doesn't get referred to on every street project. So, for example, the comp plan may have long-range vision, it may look at the whole road network, it may talk about new requirements for development and things like that, but it will probably miss out opportunities like some of the operational things that we talked about, right? And staff has to be really aware of it, developers have to be aware of it, people who do development review have to be aware of it too. And does it have enough stick-to-itiveness too? We're not sure about the stickiness factor of a comp plan. But I don't want to discourage you. If that's what you're doing now, absolutely try to incorporate it into your comp plan. In fact, Alexandria, Virginia, Alexandria, Louisiana, where I just came from, we did have a planner attend it, and she's working on the comp plan for that town. And even though it wasn't a complete streets workshop, she really thought this is a great opportunity to incorporate a lot of those, yeah. Okay. Yeah, any other questions? But any more ideas as far as things that you could measure to indicate that you are successful? Okay, other than that, I'll just give you some examples here of things I come up with. These are not in any particular order, or not even the top 15, but reduce crashes, safety, so really looking at, are we making the roads safer? Are more people walking, bicycling, using in transit? Adopt a level of service level measure that captures more than just vehicles going by, because level of service is interesting. Does anyone want to guess? A car with one driver counts as one vehicle. A car with a driver and 3 passengers counts as one vehicle. A bus with 35 people on it counts as 1. A pedestrian counts as 0. A bicyclist counts as 0. So if we do develop the driverless car, it'll count as 1, believe it or not, and the person on foot will count as 0. So making sure we capture that. Increase in business occupancy rates, increase real estate values, recruit and retain desirable employees, the whole thing of creating a quality environment, air quality. Health is nearly always in the top 3. Has anyone heard of a health impact statement, similar to an environmental impact statement? If we had adopted a health impact statement for all our projects in the last 50 years, we wouldn't have built a single project that we built in the last 50 years. They would all fail. I cannot think of a traditional road project that improves the health of the people using that road or living next to the road. You know, think about that, right? That's probably why we never adopted one. So these, you know, just some examples here of some of the things you need to include in complete streets when you adopt a policy. So getting back to your question about a comp plan too, if you want different outcomes, you need to have different goals. And to set different goals, you need to make sure that they express outcomes that people in your community want. And if people in your community just say, well, I just want to be able to get to work as fast as I can, or get out of Norfolk as fast as I can, or get those pesky commuters through my community as fast as you can can end up with the same kind of community we've been building for 30, 40 years. So I think it's a good opportunity to address it. There's no doubt about that. Yeah. Great. Phew. Well, I'm sorry I had to talk so fast through it all, but I think we did cover really what I hope to cover here, which is really some of the really essential key elements of what's involved in a complete streets policy. We're not, like I said, didn't want to talk about the street design as much as thinking in terms of what it can mean for your community and how it really can transform the look and feel of the streets in your community. So with that, there's no more questions. I really would like to thank you for inviting me, and hope the outcome is positive, that you do consider this.